Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. If you love what you see here, everything is for sale. We are waking up with watches. Prices in the description when available. If not, reach out to me. I have full pricing, accessory condition, and additional photographs ready at my fingertips. Reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com for pricing, and we are always looking to build inventory. Buy, sell, or trade. We do all three. We buy with cash, we pay fast. We will buy your entire collection, no upper limit on value paid. To buy, trade, or sell, reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com. All right, jumping straight in, I promised the Ed White, I deliver the Ed White. Here it is. This is the Omega Speedmaster Chronograph Calibre 321, launched, or I should say maybe relaunched, in 2020. This watch is a faithful tribute to the reference 105003 that was used by American astronaut Ed White in 1965 on America's first spacewalk. So this is known as the Ed White. It has the case that first debuted in the modern era on 2012's first Omega in space. So it's 39.7 millimeters in diameter. It's 48 lug to lug. You can see there's no beveling, there's no lyre style lugs, there's no crown guard profile. This is the professional case design, and you can see because we have a pivoted end link to the bracelet, it wears true to size. We have a vintage Omega logo on the crown, on the dial, and on the bracelet. Now, the bracelet's designed to be vintage evocative, but it is modern in construction, as is the clasp, which uses a twin trigger release and has a very thick gauge steel internal swing arm. The watch wear is relatively compact. It's 14.1 millimeters thick. It is upscale in some ways that Ed's watch would not have been. It has a sapphire crystal on both sides. It has a ceramic tachymeter scale. You can see, although it does have a very subtle and tastefully applied photina, it's not overbearing. There is plenty of luminescence, and the watch has a matte black dial with dished sub-registers, white varnished hands, and you'll note features like the dot over 90 on the vintage-inspired tachymeter scale. The watch does feature the Calibre 321. I'd been saying for years before this came out that I thought Omega would someday reissue this movement, and it comes from a studio that works just on these Calibre 321s. Lange-based, not the 1873 of the Moonwatch Calibre, but the Lange 2310 that, among other things, served as the CH2770 in the Patek Philippe 5070. So this is a true high horology movement, finished to a high degree. Although it's not entirely hand-finished, it's much more lovingly finished than the current 3861 movement. I would go so far as to say that the finish on this is comparable to what we saw in the old 1863 display caseback Moonwatch Calibre. Okay, let's talk about tech. First of all, we have a column wheel lateral clutch chrono that is absolutely beautiful. We have a watch that beats away at a nostalgic and evocative 18,000 vibrations per hour. It does have a handmade Breguet overcoil hairspring for concentric breathing in every position. The watch has that wonderfully crisp column wheel architecture, which is a real pleasure to operate, as the column wheel is particularly well tuned for crisp and instantaneous action. You can see the vintage Omega and Speedmaster logos, and then that vintage applique Omega logo. Now, after the Calibre 321s, with the arrival of the 1861 Calibre in 1968, they went to printed Omega logos. So this is a throwback in more ways than one. The dial is beautifully rose gilded, and it actually has more power reserve than a Moonwatch Calibre. Due to the slow beat rate of 18K, it runs for 55 hours per winding. It is really nicely done. You have that gilding of the bridges, you have the satin steel of the chronograph components, the golden wheels, the violet pivot jewels, and that blue hairspring. Very, very, very special. We'll throw it on my wrist where I think it shows itself well. It's a watch that a man or a woman could wear. It's not thin, not by any margin, but it is relatively short across the wrist, and that recommends it immensely to me. Now, let's say you want a vintage style, but you want the real thing. Well, here's a roughly 1987 Rolex 5513. This was the end of the line for the 5513, which debuted in the early 60s and ran till the end of the 80s. 40 millimeters in steel. What we have here is a later example of the 5513 dial, black lacquer with applique indices. Now we'll do a quick loom shot here just so you can get a better sense. It does have a subsequent service replacement bezel pearl, but the hands and the dial are original factory tritium. There are a lot of vintage elements on this watch that mark it as a product of its time, and its time was the early 60s when it was originally designed. Bidirectional rotating dive bezels were quite common. As you could see, it also has a dramatically domed plexiglass crystal. The watch, I would say it's daily driver condition. The case is good, but not great. It's seen some refinishing. There are some dents in the end of the lugs. And of course, it's mounted on a strap, which I should mention is a factory Rolex strap, with a factory Rolex pin buckle. I've often said that this is what Cellini should be. Cellini should be strap-clad luxe versions of Rolex sports watches. Rather than trying to create dress watches that no one wants, variations on the Rolex sports watch could very easily be a dress watch. And that's often how people wear their vintage dive watches. They wear them for their grace, for their charm, for the character that comes with years, and for the fact that old sports watches generally are considerably smaller and more discreet and better suited to formal attire than modern sports watches. So this is a great way to get into a vintage Rolex that's very usable, in good overall condition. The dial is plus plus, the bezel insert and bezel are very good. Mechanically, it's in outstanding condition. Again, the timepiece, I would say, is a 7 from a case standpoint, and then pretty close to a 9 in every other regard. A real wearable, real-world, pre-alphanumeric vintage Rolex diver. Okay, let's go upscale. Let's go way upscale. Let's go back to 2019 and 20 years of the Datograph. We got the Datograph Flyback Lumen. This is a limited edition in platinum, 40.9 millimeters, a 200-piece limited series. And what sets it apart, not just from other Datograph watches, which all have a little bit of lume, but also from other Lumen watches, is the extent of the lumen used on the watch. Now you can see there is a pusher adjuster for the date disc, and because the dial is a smoked sapphire, the date disc can charge in its entirety. It's not blacked out or blocked from the light. Because of the smoked sapphire allowing enough light in, we are able to jump to date numerals that are already luminescent from prior exposure. Note the second sand is fully loomed. Note the entire chaptering outboard has been fully loomed. Let's zoom in a little bit and get a better sense. It is spectacular, and of course, it is a Datograph, which means it's a flyback chronograph, reset and restart in one push. Plus, we have fully luminescent sub-registers. This watch exceeds expectations in every way, including when you flip it over. The movement's gorgeous. As you can see, made in Germany and beautifully so. This is the current version of the Datograph movement, so you get a 60 to 65 hour power reserve, manually wound, 18K beat rate, free sprung, overcoil hairspring, 5-position adjustment, lateral clutch with a column wheel, German silver bridges, pivot jewels in chaton, and as good as it gets. We will take a quick look at this watch on my wrist, and you can see, though, it's basically a 41 millimeter platinum watch. It still wears well. It's not excessively broad from lug to lug, nor is it excessively thick. This is probably, along with the Zeitwerk Lumen, co-equally the coolest loomed watch Lange has ever made, and a real prize for any collector, whether it's the capstone to your Lange collection, your first Lange, or simply the ultimate exclusive complication in a collection of high horology. This is a watch that could do a lot for many different collections, including a collection of one. If this were your only watch, what a way to go solo. And you can see, because of that smoked sapphire, the dial side of the movement is immensely visible. There's a little power reserve indicator again for that 60-hour power reserve. A very, very special watch. But then again, so is this. In DLC black titanium, this is the Freak X, 43 millimeters in diameter. This is the Freak with a crown that debuted back in 2019. It's also 50 meters water resistant, which is sufficient for surface exposure, making this one of the most water resistant Freaks ever constructed. Now, as with every Freak, it features a baguette style movement that bears the terminal end of the drivetrain, the escapement, and the balance, and the minute hand and the baguette movement are one and the same. Let me show you quickly that the watch is quite well loomed for a Freak. It's not just the hour and the minute hand, it is also the indices. Now, it's a lot of fun to play with, I'm not going to lie. Taking the carousel, and it is properly a carousel, not a tourbillon, it orbits around the dials. There's a separate drive system for the escapement as well as the carousel platform. That is how I'm able to move it without crashing the escapement. UN makes its own silicon. It has since 2006 when it bought a company called Sigatech. So we have a silicon escapement that's unlubricated, we have a silicon hairspring that's anti-magnetic, and then we have a silicon and white gold balance wheel that is free sprung for durability and precision. Flip it all over, we have automatic winding and a 3-day power reserve. You can see it's a magic lever style pawl-based system. And as with old Ulysse, Nardin marine chronometers, which helped the company to build its reputation in the 19th century, we have individual numbering via a bolt-fixed plate on the side. The Freak, as a design, is the signature of Ulysse Nardin. It is the icon of the company. Whereas most companies' iconic watches, like the Reverso, the Moonwatch, the Calatrava, tend to be very basic and elemental watches, the Freak has anything but. The Freak is a more is more type watch in every way except mass, as this example, made entirely of titanium and sapphire, is feather light on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist. If you're going to buy a UN, you should buy a Freak. If you're going to buy a Freak, this is one of the most accessibly priced ways to enter the club. Okay, Rolex. We're not done yet. We got a few more coming, starting with the Milgauss. This is the Milgauss GV, not the Z Blue. This is the watch that debuted back in 2007, and it caused a sensation, as there are elements here that are decidedly more colorful and whimsical than you would typically expect on a Rolex designed for engineers. We have orange, we have multi-tonal dial features, we have a matte rather than gloss black dial, we have a green glass or glassware, green crystal. The watch has a orange varnished lightning bolt seconds hand, which is an absolute ball to experience, as it's just a riot. The lightning bolt is an element from the original watch in the 1950s, so it is not in and of itself postmodernist or ironic. It's the fact that it is so colorful that makes it so. That is the element that this watch brings to the table, and in an incredibly unusual and rare case, Rolex has used two different colors of Luminova on this dial. Heck, there are two different colors for the indices, but it carries over to the Lume shot. The watch looks like a beefier Oyster Perpetual, which is to say, without the rotating bezel, without a date and a Cyclops eye magnifier, and a relatively low profile of 13.3 millimeters thick, it's a flat watch that fits under a cuff. So while there's a little bit of Dada and postmodernism to the design, there's also an elegance and a symmetry that makes this watch suitable for formal attire. So it's your sports watch, and it is also your dress watch if you so choose. It's easily wearable by a woman. A 13.5 centimeter circumference wrist should have no problem. It is highly anti-magnetic, and I cannot overstate this. The combination of an anti-magnetic escapement, niobium zirconium hairspring, and soft iron paramagnetic cage makes this watch far more than 1,000 Gauss or 80,000 ampere per meter anti-magnetic. How far beyond, I have yet to determine, but I can tell you this: the name on the dial is a lie. It's there for nostalgic and historical reasons, but this watch is much more highly hardened against magnetism than Milgauss. It is an automatic winder, 48-hour power reserve, a chronometer, and water resistant to 100 meters. There is a lot to love here. But this show features the best of East and West. And here we have a lovely 60th anniversary watch from Grand Seiko. This watch, let's see how close I can get to this dial, features the company's signature blue dial, SBGR 321, a limited edition for 2020 celebrating 60 years of Grand Seiko. This is a 2,500 piece limited edition that, like the Milgauss, is 40 millimeters steel and 100 meters water resistant. Automatic winding, caliber 9S65, regulated to run no worse than -3 + 5 seconds per day, 3-day power reserve, full bracelet with deployant clasp, and a custom oxidized rotor on the reverse side with a beautiful array of reds, golds, and blues, and underneath the hand-regulated 9S65 movement. It looks great on the wrist. Lug to lug, it's just over 46 millimeters, so it's fairly compact, and it has that typical banana-shaped 9S profile that works well on a smaller wrist. The dial furniture, I should mention, is as good as any in the business. I've often considered Grand Seiko and Rolex co-equally the authors of the finest mass-produced luxury dials, both for the grandeur of the materials used and for the finishing details on the individual components. And on Grand Seiko, that's always the faceting and differential satin and polish of hands and indices. It is very, very special. We continue to barrel headlong through some very fine watches with two rather special pieces, both featuring lacquered dials. First here, we have a limited series of 2,000 pieces for 2018, 150 years of IWC. This is the Portofino Chronograph edition, 150 years. The dial involves 12 steps of lacquering and hand polishing to create the look of an enamel dial on a late 19th century IWC pocket watch. The Portofino family, inspired by the giant Portofino of 1984, features a pocket watch-like case and straight welded lugs that project out from the case and have the spare look of a pocket watch converted to a wristwatch. Now here we have blued hands, leaf style and a lancet style, counterweighted seconds hand. The watch includes a day and a date with a double quick set. You can adjust them both. I love that. The pump style pushers are dramatically vintage in profile. And although this is a cam action chronograph, the action is superb. The feel is crisp. The steel case is 42 millimeters in diameter, and you are getting a hand-finished dial. Again, after each one of the 12 steps, both ivory, lacquer, and clear coat were hand polished on these special Jubilee anniversary dials. This is a really cool way to get into an affordably priced point of entry to one of the great brands in luxury horology. But if you've got a bit more budget, and perhaps you want something a tad warmer, may I suggest a watch that debuted at Baselworld 2016. This is the 39mm rose gold 5327R from Patek Philippe. Lots to love. Ivory lacquered dial with applique polished Breguet Arabic numerals. You know you're looking at a special Patek when you see Breguet Arabics. Now, we also have an interesting case profile with deeply scalloped lugs and then a concave bezel. So although 9.8 millimeters thick, which is pretty thin, it looks even thinner. On the reverse side, caliber 240Q, micro rotor automatic, a long-running movement first launched in 1977. When you see a center rotor Patek, you know you're looking at one of their general production automatics. When you see micro rotor, you know you're looking at something special, a flagship, and that's what we have here. You have the open caseback vista of a manual wind, the thin profile of a manual wind, and yet the convenience of an automatic. 3 hertz beat rate, so 6 beats per second, 6 position adjusted, 48-hour power reserve, and beautifully finished. Admittedly, below the grand complication level, Patek generally uses a combination of manual and hand finishing, but Patek weights the hand finishing elements more than brands such as, for example, F.P. Journe or Audemars Piguet, where milling marks are generally left on bevels that are started mechanically but finished manually. Here, the bevels are started mechanically, but they're finished manually to a mirrored shine that leaves none of the underlying milling visible, which is very, very special and very important. And to me, it's a high priority that little details like that are remembered on a watch like this. Of course, a perpetual calendar, so you need not ever touch the calendar. If it stops, you reset it. Otherwise, it can deal with irregular length months and leap years. But let's take a look at some budget options for those who don't have Patek and Lange money to throw around. Starting with Sinn. That's right, Sinn for many years made a Navitimer. Well, it wasn't called a Navitimer. Their German terminology is that it is a navigation watch, Navigationsuhr, and this is a lovely piece. In the late 70s, when Breitling went bankrupt, Sinn bought up the rights, components, and tooling to produce its own Navitimers. Of course, they weren't called Navitimers. This is the reference 903, but I understand there was a little bit of ambiguity over just how much rights Sinn had purchased, and to this day, there's a little bit of bad blood regarding Sinn and Breitling's relationship and whether Sinn is truly blessed with Breitling's permission to make this style. There's enough historical ambiguity, though, that Sinn continues to make the 903 and versions of the 903, and they do it a little bit differently than Breitling. You have a rotating circular slide rule logarithmic scale calculator that is turned using a crown, the idea being once set, it's much easier to leave it in place without displacing it. We have a dial here that is admittedly designed to reference those late 70s, early 80s Sinn Navitimers, because we've got mucho fotina, but plenty of luminescence. The watch does include 100-meter water resistance and a screw-down crown, something you will find on no Navitimer. Those tend to be 30 meters. And you can see it uses a high-grade ETA 7750, and we know it's an ETA because you can see the ETA stamp below the balance. It is delivered in top grade and adjusted in-house at Sinn, so these tend to run very, very nicely. It is approximately 41.5 millimeters if you measure it at the edge of the bezel, which is a little bit further out than the case band. Throw it on the wrist and it wears much like a Navitimer 41. If you want an idea of how it wears like a Navitimer 41. The Navitimer is as much a part of Sinn's history as it is of Breitling's at this point, and I consider both of them to be legit, but if you want a more water-resistant and, let's be honest, less common variant of the circular slide rule calculator chronograph, this is the way to go. Okay, Omega, you want to go large and in charge, perhaps a little bit overbearing, but if you've got a big wrist, this is your match made in heaven. The 45.5mm stainless steel Omega Seamaster Planet Ocean 600-meter master chronometer. The latest version of Omega's beefiest dive chronograph. You can see it fits on my wrist at 16 centimeters, but I think the best entry-level wrist size for this is going to be 17, just a little bit larger. This is a 19mm thick watch, so take note, you're not going to wear it underneath the cuff. It's not as broad across the wrist as it could have been. At just under 52mm, I consider this watch designed to be used on a lower limit wrist, but I do believe my wrist, though it could wear the watch securely, is proportionally too small. So 17 centimeters circumference wrist or larger. The dial is black ceramic. The hands are rhodium plated. The bezel is mostly a ceramic insert, but the first 15 minutes in orange, that's actually a rubber insert. Bezel feel is the best I've experienced on an Omega dive watch, and it gives you the ability to time a second 60-minute span alongside the chronograph timing. The watch does not have screw-down pushers. They're shouldered, but they're not screw-down, so you can operate them at any time without first threading them out. The watch is still 600 meters water-resistant, has a helium escape valve, and the Master Chronometer Calibre 9900, which is a vertical clutch, column wheel, Master Chronometer certified anti-magnetic 60-hour automatic power reserve chronograph movement. The watch also has a feature that's useful if you are a traveler. While the chronograph is still operating and the minutes hand remains undisplaced, you can change your local hour, and there's a mono counter over at 3 o'clock, so you've got your hours and your chronograph minutes all on one dial for a more symmetrical and compact, less crowded dial layout. Also take note the watch is well loomed, including the chronograph subregisters, and the bezel pearl and the minute hand are green, so you can easily view your dive time while you are in pitch black. But not everyone wants a giant Seamaster, which is why we have the original 2002 Seamaster Aqua Terra. This is how it was released back in 2002, a rare display caseback variant of the Omega coaxial caliber 2500. So this took the place of the long-running Seamaster 120. It's 150 meters water resistant. It's 39.2 millimeters in diameter, and it's only about 11.4 millimeters thick, which makes it one of the thinnest coaxial automatic Omega watches ever made. Now, it wears nicely on the wrist. It's fairly compact, short across the wrist, and very comfortable. It's a lady's watch. It's a man's watch. No issues with smaller wrists as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference. The movement is fascinating. It is adapted from the Omega Calibre 1120, which was itself a ETA modified Omega exclusive variant of the 289282. So this is descendant of the 289282, but they make changes. It's free sprung, it's coaxial escapement, it's chronometer certified, and whereas a basic 2892 has a 42-hour power reserve, this right here is 48. It is quite thin, and it's actually pretty good looking, though it's not designed to be a high horology movement in the aesthetic sense. It is a high horology movement in the mechanical sense, as this was the debut of George Daniels' coaxial escapement system in Omega watches, and it was a real breakthrough. It was something he invented in 1974 and spent the next 25 years trying to sell to mainstream brands, and only Omega had the courage to industrialize this unusual independent horology innovation in a mainstream watch. The watch has plenty of lume, as you can see, including all three hands, so it is a very practical surf and turf watch. It is not a professional dive watch, but it's more water resistant than just about any dress watch. It serves equally well if you are on the deck of your yacht, swimming at the pool at the yacht club, or dancing in the ballroom. This is a watch for all occasions and, truthfully, all wrists. This is not. If you want a really beefy watch, if you've got the wrist for it, if you want something distinctive, if you like Panerai but you think they all look the same, allow me to introduce you to this 2021 limited edition. As you can see, 500 pieces in titanium. This is the Panerai Luminor Submersible Flyback Chronograph PAM 1291 Mike Horn. It's the 7th Explorer-themed Mike Horn collaboration watch made by Panerai, and it has a beautiful array of colors. You can see black, white, yellow, blue, all of it on a dial dedicated to diving clarity and chronograph operation. It is a flyback chrono. It is a caliber P9100, automatic winding, 3-day power reserve. You can see it as a 0 reset seconds hand for easy setting. We have pushers right here for the chronograph system. And it is a vertical clutch, so there's no jump when the system starts. It's also a column wheel, so it's nice and crisp. It has a sapphire that is ringed by a ceramic cap on top of a titanium grade 5 bezel base. So there's a lot of materials here that are profoundly scratch tolerant. And you can see that the watch has plenty of lume. As with the Omega we saw just a moment ago, the bezel pearl, and how much do you like the chunkiness of that bezel? But the bezel pearl is bright blue, so you can easily align it with the minute hand for dive timing. Note you can also see the chronograph sub-register hands in the dark. The watch is 300 meters water resistant, but it is big. And by the way, flyback chrono, reset and restart with one push of the trigger. No date dial, so it's a little cleaner than it would otherwise have been had they tried to fit in a date. It has the ceramic capped bezel like you'll find on, for example, the 389 and the 1389. And it's a 48 click bezel, which means it's not quite as fine in terms of resolution or precision as something like a Rolex. But I could play with this bezel all day just to appreciate the sound and the feel. On my wrist, it's oversized. I could wear this as a sports watch for adventures and weekends. I probably couldn't get away with wearing it every day. It's just too big for that. The style is fine if I'm wearing a wetsuit and diving on a wreck or a reef. But around the office, you've got to have a personality to match to wear a thing that looks like this. Of course, it is a Luminor, which means it has the device protecting the crown, the lever locking system, and one of the few cases where you will see the crown colored and shouldered. It has a rubber shoulder in blue surrounding it and a little bearing in the cam to make the action smoother. A very special watch and a very unusual Panerai watch. Big, but not huge. Right here we have the 42 millimeter white gold Rolex Yachtmaster. Now this is not the Yachtmaster 3, though it practically could be, as it's a very different breed from the standard Yachtmaster or the Yachtmaster 2 Regatta chronograph. This is the 226659 and it's gray gold, which means it never needs to be rhodium plated. It is large with an Oyster Flex strap and a feature you don't find even on other Oyster Flex watches. We have a glide lock system, which I believe gives us 12 millimeters of 2 millimeter incremental adjustment. This is a lot more adjustment than you get with EasyLink. This is close to what you get on a Rolex dive watch. So this watch is designed to be worn on the assumption that you may not be able to get the perfect size out of the strap bracelet. The bracelet internally, inside the rubber, the Oyster Flex is a nickel titanium alloy, so you can't actually cut it. So Rolex gives you a lot of adjustability with several strap length options and then that glide lock system to fine tune. It's 100 meters water resistant. It's well loomed, very well loomed. It has a ceramic bezel cap with both polish and satin, which you can see here. 3-day power reserve, chronometer certified, anti-magnetic as well as shock resistant with plenty of luminescence, absolutely no shortage whatsoever. The bezel, which is ceramic on top of white gold, is bidirectional, so it's not life-saving equipment like a dive bezel, but it's used to count down to the start of a match or a race within a sailboat regatta. This is for the master of a yacht, hence the name Yacht Master. People always ask to see the back of Rolex watches. Okay, not much to see here, Oyster case, but sometimes it's nice to get a solid gold case back that's worth a few $100 rather than a piece of sapphire that is worth a few dozen. Okay, a heavy hitter from De Bethune, a watch originally launched in 2006. This is the DB25 Power Reserve. It's in rose gold. It has a blue titanium dial. It's 44 millimeters in diameter, and it's automatic winding with a 6-day power reserve. Now you can see I'll wind the watch manually. There's a power reserve indicator up at 12 o'clock. It transitions from red to silver as it winds. You can wind it or it can wind itself. De Bethune has a patented process for bluing titanium, and you can see it is metallized the minutes track outboard on top of that blued titanium. Now they have bright blued titanium that's polished, and that's what forms the cabochon for the hour indices. And then they have a matte blued titanium that's used for the chaptering for the minutes. You can see the dial has great depth to it, and then for the center as well. Guilloche, that they call microlight, a very fine reductive engraving, is rendered concentrically on the center because they didn't think a rosette style guilloche would look right on a watch this modern. The hands are black polished. When you flip it all over, you can see that this watch includes an automatic movement of the company's own design. We have a titanium rotor with a platinum mass and a huge effective lever arm length to maximize winding efficiency. But because there is so much torque, sometimes not just rotational, but torsional on the center. There are 4 cantilevered springs that include low friction jewels inserted, and those are there to brace the rotor against shock. We have 1, 2, 3 shock protection springs on a balance that's made of platinum and titanium, and it is non-annular, which means it's actually a yoke crossed over a yoke, like 2 battle axes crossed. It's not a ring, it is discontinuous. And the idea here is to minimize the thermal variation due to temperature change. It doesn't really affect the timing here. And with the platinum bulbs outboard, the idea is to put as much of the mass as possible outboard to improve the polar moment. The watch has, again, 2 barrels, self-adjusting, that's patented, triple parachute, that's the shock protection system, that's patented. The rotor shock protection system, that's patented. The bluing of titanium, that's patented. There's a lot of original research and development protecting this watch. And de Bethune makes its own cases, dials, and movements. So this watch is all manufactured. Very impressive. De Bethune has made about 3,000 watches since its founding in 2002, so exclusivity is assured. Today, the company makes only about 200 to 220 watches per year. In 2010, de Bethune launched the DB28, and to mark 20 years of the watch that won at the 2011 GPHG Aiguille d'Or, de Bethune launched this, the DB28 XP. It is the 10th anniversary DB28 in all but name. The purpose here is reduction of thickness. No DB28 is particularly thick, but I've measured this at 8.7 millimeters, meaning it's only about half a millimeter thicker than a Royal Oak extra thin, and you can see that that microlight engraving that we saw on the dial of the previous DB25 has been rendered on the grade 5 titanium case of this watch. We have floating lugs from 54.5 millimeters across the wrist. Compress them, they are spring loaded. They can be as close coupled as 50.5 millimeters from each other, so this is variable geometry to fit on your wrist. On the dial side, we have a black polished cap to the barrel bridge. You can see microlight has been rendered on the cap above the base plate. The wheels of the barrel, they've been satinated. We have fired blue titanium hands at center. We have a glorious surfacing of the full bridge for the balance. You can see it has been black polished with 1, 2, 3, 4 sharp interior angles where bevels meet. We have the balance now a redesign. This balance is now a ring with white gold masses. De Bethune has at least 8 different proprietary patented balance designs. The idea with each new generation is to improve the timekeeping regularity of the watch. There's also a flat hairspring that breathes concentrically like an overcoil because it's 2 hand-shaped elements clamped together, so it has perfectly centered mass. You can see there's a black polished chaptering outboard. The dial has excellent depth. We still have the triple parachute, triple shock protection system, and we have a little track for reading the minutes with little globes of polished titanium acting as the hour indices. On the reverse side, you can see more microlight as well as blued titanium and mirrored grade 5 titanium. The nice thing about grade 5 tie is that it is lighter than steel, but it is also more scratch resistant than steel, and it's hypoallergenic. This watch works perfectly on my 14 centimeter circumference wrist, or 16, pardon me, centimeter circumference wrist. I got ahead of myself. This watch could be worn on a wrist as small as 14 centimeters circumference, and you can see it is paper flat. So if you wanted to wear it as a dress watch, it would fit underneath the cuff. Finally, we end with a big piece, figuratively speaking. The Vacheron Constantin Overseas Ultra-Thin Perpetual Calendar. The original version of the Gen 3 Perpetual Calendar arrived in rose gold for 2019. For 2021, we get what you see right here. Lacquered blue dial on a black polished metal base. The watch is 41.5 millimeters in diameter, is 8.4 millimeters thick. It is all in white gold. As you can see, there is a perpetual calendar, and it's a beautifully loomed watch. This is a true sports watch, make no mistake. The timepiece has the perpetual calendar, so it's able to deal with irregular length months and leap years. It also has a 50-meter water resistance, which according to Vacheron makes it suitable for surface swimming. It comes with 2 straps, one in blue rubber, one in blue leather. It comes with an extra clasp and a full bracelet. The bracelet is extravagantly detailed and chock-a-block with features, and because the watch features a quick-release lug system, you can quickly and easily swap between the straps and the bracelets that come with the watch. Now flip it over and you get the best of the best. Not only is this a Geneva hallmark movement, you can see quite easily the Geneva hallmark on the balance cock, it is a Geneva hallmark case, as since mid-2012, that standard applies to the quality of the entire assembled watch. Now this is the 1120, which is Vacheron's version of the old JLC 920 Bausch, also used by and designed expressly for Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe. Those three brands, AP, VC, and Patek, the only three to ever use this movement. Now here you can see it's finished to Geneva hallmark standards. It's got a beryllium ring. You can see this little ring that runs all the way around. The rotor is annular. The mass is one-sided. The mass is actually 22 karat gold and quadruply finished. So the reason you have that beryllium ring is it pivots on 4 ruby rollers and everything is sunken very close coupled. But because of those ruby rollers and the full beryllium rotor ring, the rotor and the ring can't crash into the bridges or plates, which allows this movement to be ultra thin. Even with the Perpetual calendar, it's just 4.1 millimeters thick. It's a free-sprung Gyromax style balance, and as you can see, finish is exquisite, living up to the Geneva hallmark's reputation. It's a 40-hour automatic winding power reserve, very traditionally made, and it fits beautifully. Make no mistake, this is a rare watch, rarely purchased and rarely available, and it is wonderfully compact. A second skin in white gold and absolutely gorgeous. And I should mention, this is gray gold. This is the white gold that never needs to be rhodium plated. Reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing details.